Picture the desert at dawn. The sun has not yet risen, but the horizon glows with a pale amber light that turns the sand into something between gold and ash. The wind moves across the dunes in slow, patient waves, as if the earth itself is breathing. And there, half buried in centuries of silence, stones emerge from the sand massive, weathered, anonymous. No inscriptions mark them. No tourist paths lead to their base. They simply exist, as they have existed long after the voices that once filled this place have faded into myth. These are the ruins that history forgot to name. Temples, perhaps, or sanctuaries, or something older still, places where the boundary between earth and sky grew thin, where ancient peoples gathered not merely to worship, but to remember. The stones bear no readable record, yet they whisper, not in language, but in presence, in the way they catch the light, in the precision of their placement, in the stubborn fact that they remain at all. Archaeologists catalog them with clinical distance, pre-dynastic, unattributed, function unknown, but stand among them as the stars emerge, and a different question rises unbidden. What if these were not built to honor gods the builders believed in, but gods they remembered? What if the faith that raised these stones was not hope, but mourning, a desperate architecture of memory, erected to preserve something already fading from human recollection? The mainstream narrative speaks of primitive peoples, of nascent religion, of humanity's first stumbling attempts to impose meaning on an indifferent cosmos. But the stones themselves suggest otherwise. They are too deliberate, too precisely aligned, too deeply embedded in landscapes that have changed beyond recognition. The desert was not always desert. The rivers did not always run where they run now. And these ruins, these whispering stones, may have been ancient long before the first pharaoh claimed divinity, long before the first ziggurat rose above the Mesopotamian plain. We stand at the beginning of a journey through time and stone, through myth and memory, through the sacred architecture of civilizations that built not merely for themselves, but for something or someone they believed would return. The temples are silent now, but silence too can speak. Rewind the clock. Not centuries, but millennia. Back beyond bronze and iron, beyond the first cities, beyond even the invention of writing. 11,000 years ago, on a plateau in what is now southeastern Turkey, human hands moved stone with purpose. This was Göbekli Tepe, the world's oldest known temple complex, predating Stonehenge by 6,000 years, predating the pyramids by 7. The mainstream archaeological narrative tells us this. Göbekli Tepe represents humanity's transition from nomadic hunter-gatherers to settled civilization. It was, they say, the birth of organized religion, the moment when scattered tribes came together, not for survival, but for something transcendent. They carved massive T-shaped pillars from bedrock, decorated them with foxes and scorpions and serpents, and arranged them in circles that faced the stars. Then, for reasons no one can adequately explain, they buried it all, deliberately, completely, as if hiding it from something or preserving it for someone. But here the questions multiply like shadows at dusk. These were supposedly primitive peoples, lacking metal tools, lacking beasts of burden, lacking even agriculture. Yet they moved stones weighing 20 tons. They carved three-dimensional reliefs with surgical precision. They encoded astronomical alignments into architecture that would not be matched for thousands of years. How? And more troubling still, why? Some scholars suggest these were ceremonial sites, places where shamanic rituals connected the living with the spirit world. Others propose they were early calendars, marking solstices and equinoxes for nascent farming communities. Both theories carry weight. Both satisfy the academic need for rational explanation. But neither quite accounts for the sophistication, the scale, the sheer improbability of such structures, arising from a culture that, according to conventional timelines, should not yet have possessed the organizational capacity to conceive them. What if Göbekli Tepe was not the beginning, but an echo? What if the builders were not inventing sacred architecture, but remembering it recreating, as best they could with stone and sweat, something they had inherited from an even earlier time? The temples may have been new, but the knowledge that shaped them might have been ancient beyond reckoning. And Göbekli Tepe was not alone. Across the world, Paleolithic sanctuaries emerge from the archaeological record-painted caves in France and Spain, megalithic chambers in Malta, stone circles in Africa. All of them suggest a reverence that predates civilization itself, a spiritual architecture that seems less like primitive superstition and more like fragments of a forgotten cosmology. The first builders of reverence did not write down their purposes. They could not, but they left behind stones that refuse to be dismissed, alignments that demand explanation, and a legacy that whispers of something older than history dares to record. Meanwhile, in the Fertile Crescents where great rivers carved life from desert, another kind of temple rose. Not from hilltops or isolated plateaus, but from the hearts of the world's first cities Uruk and Ur in Mesopotamia, Memphis and Thebes in Egypt, Mohenjo-Daro along the Indus. These were not hidden sanctuaries for shamans and initiates, but towering public monuments, centers of power and piety alike. The mainstream view is clear. These temples were administrative hubs, economic engines, and religious theaters rolled into one. Priests managed grain stores, recorded tax receipts, and performed rituals that legitimized kings. The gods themselves, Enki, Ra, Inanna, Thoth, were understood as metaphors, personifications of natural forces and social order. The temples were built to honor them, yes, but also to organize society around them, to transform chaos into hierarchy, wilderness into civilization. Yet the ancient texts themselves tell a stranger story. The Sumerian king list speaks of a time before the flood when kingship descended from heaven, when gods ruled directly and taught humanity the arts of civilization. Egyptian hymns describe the first time, a golden age when deities walked the Nile and raised temples not with human hands, but with divine words that compelled stone itself to rise. The Rig Veda and Mahabharata speak of the Treta Yuga, when gods and mortals lived side by side, when sacred architecture served not to honor distant powers, but to house present ones. Are these merely myths? Poetic embellishments of mundane historical events? Or do they preserve, however distorted by time and translation, a memory of something real? Consider the Temple of Karnak, a sprawling complex of pylons, obelisks, and hypostyle halls that took over 2,000 years to complete. Its great hypostyle hall alone covers an area larger than the Cathedral of Notre Dame, supported by 134 columns, some reaching 70 feet into the air. The mainstream narrative credits this to the labor of pharaohs, each adding to their predecessor's legacy. But Egyptian tradition insists the original foundation was far older, laid down in the time of the gods and merely restored by human kings. The same pattern repeats across cultures. The Assyrian at Abydos, with its massive Cyclopean blocks, is officially dated to Seti I around 1300 BCE, yet its architecture resembles nothing else from that era. And some geologists argue its water erosion patterns suggest construction during a much wetter climate, thousands of years earlier. The temples of the Indus Valley show urban planning and hydraulic engineering that would not be seen again until Roman times. Yet their script remains undeciphered, their builders anonymous, their purpose obscure. What if these river temples were not humanity's first attempts at sacred architecture, but reconstruction's conscious imitations of something older that the rivers themselves had washed away? What if the gods who walked among rivers were not supernatural beings, but the last remnants of a civilization advanced enough to seem divine to those who came after? The rivers remember. They carry sediment and myth in equal measure. And buried beneath their banks, waiting for the right flood or the right archaeologist's spade, may lie answers that history is not yet ready to accept. Centuries earlier, The Sahara was not the endless expanse of lifeless sand we see today. Between roughly 10,000 and 5,000 BCE, during what climatologists call the African humid period, the desert bloomed. Monsoon rains swept inland from a warmer Atlantic, filling lakes the size of small seas, nurturing grasslands where herds of elephants and giraffes roamed, sustaining human populations who left behind rock art depicting canoes and cattle and dancing figures beneath trees that no longer exist in those latitudes. This was not Eden, but it was habitable richly, abundantly so. And where there are people, there are structures. Dwellings, gathering places, and yes, temples. Most have been scoured away by the millennia of aridity that followed, buried beneath dunes or ground to dust by relentless wind. But some remain. Petroglyphs and megaliths scattered across what is now barren wasteland, silent witnesses to a time when this land could sustain civilizations. Geologists point to evidence of massive climate shifts, the tilting of Earth's axis, the precession of equinoxes, and the periodic intensification of monsoons created windows centuries-long intervals when deserts greened and rivers flowed where none flow now. Mainstream archaeology acknowledges this, of course. It explains the sudden flourishing of Neolithic cultures in North Africa, the rapid development of Egyptian civilization along the Nile as climate refugees concentrated in the remaining fertile zones. But it also raises a more provocative possibility. What if some of Egypt's most ancient structures, those whose origins are attributed to the Old Kingdom, but whose weathering patterns defy conventional dating, were built not during the historical dynastic period, but during this earlier, wetter epoch? What if the Sphinx, with its deep water erosion, stared across a savanna rather than a desert? What if the foundations beneath temples like Dendera or Abydos were laid when the climate supported populations large and stable enough to undertake such monumental works? The notion is controversial, dismissed by most Egyptologists as fringe speculation, yet the stones themselves bear witness. Water erosion on the Sphinx enclosure suggests sustained rainfall far heavier than any experienced in the past 5,000 years. Some temples show evidence of reconstruction atop much older foundations, stones weathered in ways inconsistent with the arid conditions of dynastic Egypt. Geologists have noted this. A few have spoken cautiously about it, but the implications are too vast, too disruptive to establish timelines, and so the questions linger unanswered. Picture the Sahara green. Picture rivers cutting through what is now dust. Picture peoples we have no names for, building temples to gods we cannot identify, aligning them with stars in configurations that no longer match the sky. Then picture the rains failing. Year by year, the grasslands withering, the lakes shrinking, then vanishing, the herds moving east toward the Nile, and the people following, carrying with them fragments of knowledge, half-remembered rituals, stories of a time when the desert was a garden and the gods still spoke. The desert remembers rain, and beneath its shifting sands, beneath the silence of stone, the temples wait older, perhaps, than any king, any dynasty, any written word. There is a strange poetry to buildings constructed before language could be carved into their walls. No inscriptions explain their purpose. No dedications name their gods. No royal proclamations claim credit for their construction. They are mute monuments, and yet they speak in geometry, in orientation, in the sheer audacity of their scale. Consider again Göbekli Tepe, or the temples of Malta, or the stone circles scattered across Europe and Africa. None of them carry text. The peoples who raised them left behind no written records, no king lists, no mythologies preserved in cuneiform or hieroglyphs. We know them only by what they built, and what they built suggests minds capable of abstract thought, complex planning, and a cosmological understanding that rivals, perhaps exceeds, that of later literate civilizations. Mainstream anthropology offers explanations rooted in evolutionary psychology. Early humans, it is said, developed symbolic thinking, projected agency onto natural forces, and created rituals to manage existential anxiety. Temples were communal projects that reinforced social bonds, encoded shared beliefs, and provided a framework for cooperation at scales beyond kinship. This is reasonable. This is rational. And yet it feels incomplete, because the temples are not merely symbolic. They are functional. They track solar and lunar cycles with precision. They amplify sound in specific frequency ranges. They align with distant peaks, with solstice sunrises, with constellations whose names would not be recorded for thousands of years. This is not the work of primitive superstition, but of deliberate, sophisticated engineering. And then there are the myths, the stories told by later cultures, after writing had been invented, about the origins of sacred knowledge. The Egyptians spoke of the followers of Horus, semi-divine sages, who preceded the pharaohs and taught the arts of civilization. The Sumerians credited the Apkallu, 7 fish-like wise beings who emerged from the sea before the flood and instructed humanity in law, agriculture, and temple building. The Andean peoples revered Viracocha, a bearded figure who traveled the land teaching masonry and astronomy. The Dogon of Mali preserve legends of Venamo, ancestral teachers from the stars. Could these be dim memories of real people, not gods, not aliens, but the last survivors of a pre-literate civilization, advanced enough to seem mythical to those who came after? A people who built in stone because they had no writing to preserve their knowledge, who encoded their cosmology into architecture because monuments endure longer than memory? The absence of writing becomes, in this light, not evidence of primitiveness, but of antiquity. The stones spoke before words because they had to, because whoever raised them understood that clay tablets crumble, papyrus rots, and languages die, but stone, properly placed and precisely aligned, can carry meaning across millennia. We cannot read the temples as we read texts. But perhaps that is the point. Perhaps they were never meant to be read, but felt experienced, walked through, stood within at the precise moment when the sun strikes a particular wall or the moon rises between 2 pillars. A knowledge transmitted not through syntax, but through participation, through ritual reenactment, through the body's movement through sacred space. The stones that spoke before words still speak, if we are willing to listen with more than our ears. From Angkor Wat to Chichen Itza, from Stonehenge to Karnak, the pattern repeats. Temples oriented toward celestial events with astonishing precision. Solstices and equinoxes, lunar standstills, heliacal risings of specific stars. Ancient architects embedded the heavens into stone, creating structures that were simultaneously earthly and cosmic, places where the rhythms of sky and soil merged into something sacred. Mainstream archaeoastronomy acknowledges this, of course. It is well established that many ancient cultures possessed sophisticated knowledge of celestial mechanics. The Mayans calculated Venus cycles to within hours over centuries. The Egyptians aligned the Great Pyramid to true north with an error of less than 4 arc minutes. The builders of Stonehenge tracked the 18.6-year lunar cycle with megalithic precision. This is not controversial. It is documented, measured, and understood. But the implications are more profound than simple calendar keeping. These alignments suggest a worldview in which the cosmos was not distant or abstract, but intimately connected to human affairs. A living, breathing system in which earth and heaven mirrored one another, and temples served as the hinge between them. Take the great hypostyle hall at Karnak. Its 134 columns arranged to frame the rising sun on the winter solstice, flooding the sanctuary with light at the precise moment of solar rebirth. Or Angkor Wat, whose 3-tiered structure represents the cosmic mountain Meru, and whose western orientation aligns with equinox sunsets, symbolically linking the temple to death, rebirth, and the journey of the soul. Or Newgrange in Ireland, where a Stone Age passage tomb admits a shaft of sunlight only on the winter solstice, illuminating an inner chamber in a burst of golden light that lasts exactly 17 minutes, an effect that requires not just astronomical knowledge, but architectural mastery of light and shadow. These are not accidents. They are not approximate alignments, later interpreted as meaningful. They are precise, intentional, and often require knowledge of phenomena like the precession of the equinoxes that should not, according to conventional timelines, have been understood. Precession is the slow wobble of Earth's rotational axis, a cycle that takes approximately 26,000 years to complete. It causes the position of stars relative to the horizon to shift gradually over centuries. Ancient Greek astronomer Hipparchus is credited with discovering it around 150 BCE. Similarly, the alignment of the three pyramids at Giza with the belt stars of Orion is well known. But less often discussed is the fact that their relative positions match Orion's belt as it appeared, not in the 4th dynasty when they were supposedly built, but thousands of years earlier, at a time when the Nile's flood patterns also aligned with Orion's heliacal rising. Were these temples merely reflecting the sky as it appeared when they were built? Or were they commemorating an earlier alignment, preserving in stone a celestial configuration that had long since shifted, a kind of architectural time capsule, marking not when they were constructed, but what they were meant to remember? The pulse of the earth, it seems, is synchronized with the pulse of the heavens. And the temples, those massive stone instruments, were built to measure, mark, and perhaps even harmonize with that cosmic rhythm, a purpose that transcends worship and enters the realm of something deeper, something almost scientific in its precision, yet profoundly spiritual in its intent. Not all temples were meant to be seen. Some were meant to be heard. In the bowels of the Assyrian at Abydos, where massive red granite blocks formed chambers now half filled with groundwater, archaeologists have noticed something peculiar. The space resonates, not metaphorically, but acoustically. When certain frequencies are produced within the chamber, whether by voice, drum, or instrument, the sound does not simply echo. It amplifies, creating standing waves that can be felt as much as heard, vibrations that pass through stone and water and bone. This is not unique to Abydos. The hypogeum of Cal Saflieni in Malta, a subterranean temple carved from limestone around 3300 BCE, exhibits similar properties. Studies have shown that sounds in the 95 to 120 Hz range produce powerful resonance effects within its oracle chamber. Researchers using EEG equipment have documented changes in brain activity when subjects are exposed to these frequencies, shifts in temporal lobe function associated with altered states of consciousness, heightened emotional response, and even mild hallucination. Was this intentional? The mainstream archaeological perspective is cautiously affirmative. These spaces were likely used for ritual purposes, and the acoustic properties may have enhanced the psychological impact of ceremonies, deepening trance states, amplifying the sense of the sacred, creating an immersive sensory environment that reinforced belief. But the precision required to engineer such effects is remarkable. The chambers are not simply hollow spaces carved at random. They are shaped, proportioned, and oriented in ways that maximize specific resonant frequencies. The builders would have needed not just intuitive understanding, but empirical testing, trial and error over generations, or perhaps inherited knowledge from even earlier acoustic architects. Some researchers have gone further, suggesting that ancient builders understood the neurological effects of sound and deliberately designed temples as consciousness machines, spaces where carefully controlled acoustic environments could induce visionary states, facilitate healing, or enable what practitioners believed was direct communication with the divine. Sound temples exist across the world. The Great Pyramid's King's Chamber exhibits resonance at roughly 110 Hz. Chaco Canyon's Great Kivas in New Mexico amplify bass frequencies in ways that create immersive sonic environments. The Chavín de Huántar Temple complex in Peru features labyrinthine passages with acoustic properties that would have disoriented and awed pilgrims, preparing them for encounters with priests who could seemingly speak with the voices of gods through hidden chambers and shelled trumpets. Coincidence? Or purpose? Were these temples designed to be instruments massive, architectural instruments that played not music, but human consciousness itself? The stones hummed still. In the right conditions, with the right frequencies, they remember what they were meant to do. And standing within them, feeling the vibrations rise through your chest and skull, it becomes easy, dangerously easy, to believe that the ancients knew something we have forgotten, that they built not merely monuments, but technologies of the sacred machines of stone that bridged the gap between matter and mind, between earth and something beyond. Turn now toward Mesopotamia, the land between rivers, where ziggurats rose like artificial mountains from the flat alluvial plains. Ur, Uruk, Babylon cities, whose very names evoke ancient grandeur and mystery. And at their centers, towering stepped pyramids, brick upon brick, reaching toward the heavens in a geometry both monumental and strangely fragile. Ziggurats were not pyramids, though they are often conflated. Pyramids are solid masses, eternal tombs designed to endure. Ziggurats were hollow structures, temples built atop platforms, with staircases ascending through multiple levels to sanctuaries at their peaks. They were, according to mainstream archaeology, both religious centers and symbols of political power, the dwelling places of patron deities, maintained by priesthoods who served as intermediaries between gods and kings. The Sumerian and Akkadian texts are explicit about their function. The ziggurat at Yor, dedicated to the moon god Nana, was called Etmeneguru, the temple whose foundation creates awe. It was a place where heaven and earth met, where divine decrees were issued, where the god could descend from the celestial realm to take physical residence within the sanctuary. The famous Etemenanke of Babylon, likely the inspiration for the Tower of Babel myth, was dedicated to Marduk and described as a structure that reaches to heaven, a cosmic axis linking the underworld, earth, and sky. But the ziggurat's architecture hints at purposes beyond symbolic representation. They were oriented to cardinal directions with precision. Their dimensions followed sacred mathematical ratios. Some researchers have noted that their tiered design, with progressively smaller platforms, mirrors the structure of the cosmos as understood in Mesopotamian cosmology, the layers of heaven, the earthly realm, and the waters of the abyss below. Were they merely metaphors for cosmic order, built to reinforce religious doctrine? Or were they intended as functional devices, cosmic antennae, perhaps, designed to amplify prayers or attract divine attention through geometric harmony and astronomical alignment? The texts themselves use curious language. They speak of gods descending to ziggurat sanctuaries, of rituals performed at dawn when specific stars appeared, of ceremonies involving sound, light, and the burning of fragrant resins that filled the chambers with smoke. Some speculative scholars have suggested that these were not metaphorical descents, but something more tangible, that the ziggurats were designed as landing platforms, communication hubs, or resonance chambers for forces or beings whose nature we can no longer understand. This veers into fringe territory, of course. There is no hard evidence for such claims. But there is something undeniably haunting about the ziggurats' ruined forms, about the way they rise from the desert like skeletal fingers pointing at an indifferent sky. They were built with millions of mud bricks, each one stamped with the name of the king who commissioned it, a legacy literally baked into clay. Yet clay erodes, bricks crumble, and time has reduced most ziggurats to shapeless mounds. But the impulse that raised them, the need to build a bridge between earth and heaven, to create a physical location where the human and divine could intersect, that impulse remains etched into the ruins. The gods of clay and fire may have abandoned their mountain temples, or perhaps they were never there to begin with. But the hope that built them, the belief that architecture itself could summon the sacred, lingers in every brick, every stairway, every collapsed tier, still defying the wind and sand.
Journey now across an ocean and millennia to the high plateaus of the Andes, where the air is thin and the sky impossibly close. Here, at altitudes where breathing itself becomes labor, stand ruins that defy easy explanation, walls of stone fitted with such precision that not even a razor blade can slip between them. Blocks weighing hundreds of tons transported across mountains and valleys by peoples who, we are told, lacked wheels, lacked iron, lacked beasts of burden capable of such work. Tiwanaku, near the shores of Lake Titicaca, is one of the oldest ceremonial centers in South America, with radiocarbon dates suggesting occupation as early as 1500 BCE, though some structures may be far older. Its Gateway of the Sun, carved from a single block of andesite weighing 10 tons, is covered in intricate iconography, a central figure flanked by condor and jaguar motifs, calendar glyphs that track solar and lunar cycles with precision. Nearby, the ruins of Puma Punku present an even greater puzzle. Here, massive H-blocks and platform stones are cut with such exactitude that they interlock like three-dimensional jigsaw pieces, yet show no tool marks that would suggest how they were shaped. Mainstream archaeology attributes this to patient work with stone hammers and bronze chisels, to techniques passed down through generations of skilled masons. And perhaps that is sufficient explanation. Yet the indigenous legends tell a different story. They speak of Viracocha, the bearded creator god who wandered the land teaching the arts of civilization. He is said to have commanded stones to move with sound, to have softened rock with plant extracts, to have built the first temples in a single night, using knowledge that was later lost when his people retreated back to the stars or beneath the earth, depending on which version of the myth one consults. Such stories are dismissed as folklore, of course, poetic embellishments of mundane historical events, but they persist across cultures and centuries, from the Inca to the pre-Inca peoples, whispered in Quechua and Aymara, carved into the very stones that modern engineers struggle to explain. At Sacsayhuaman, overlooking Cusco, walls of megalithic limestone blocks, weighing over 200 tons, are fitted together in serpentine patterns that have withstood earthquakes that leveled Spanish colonial structures built atop them. The precision is not merely functional, but aesthetic, almost playful, as if the builders delighted in demonstrating mastery over material that should, by all rights, be unworkable at such scale. How were these stones moved? How were they shaped? How were they placed with such accuracy? Mainstream archaeology offers hypotheses: ramps, rollers, levers, massive labor forces coordinated over decades. These methods are plausible. They work in experimental archaeology, but the ruins themselves resist full explanation. The sheer scale, the remote locations, the absence of intermediate stages, suggesting gradual technological development, all of it creates an eerie sense that something is missing from the story. And then there is the acoustic phenomenon. At certain locations within these megalithic sites, hand claps produce unusually clear echoes, sometimes mimicking the calls of local birds, a phenomenon documented at Chichen Itza and now identified in Andean sites as well. But intentional design or acoustic coincidence? If intentional, it suggests yet another layer of sophistication, another demonstration of knowledge that seems almost anachronistic for people supposedly working with Stone Age technology. The stones of the Andes dream in silence now, beneath the weight of mountains and sky. But once, perhaps, they sang moved by hands or voices or methods we have no names for, raised by peoples whose legacy is written not in texts, but in the mute testimony of stone itself, arranged with a precision that borders on the impossible and a beauty that defies the centuries. Across the world, separated by oceans and millennia, cultures that should have had no contact tell the same story. Once there was a flood, not a local inundation, not a seasonal overflow, but a cataclysmal deluge that drowned the world, erased civilizations, and marked the boundary between ages. The Sumerian epic of Gilgamesh speaks of Utnapishtim, who survived by building a great ark. The Hebrew Bible recounts Noah's flood. Hindu texts describe Manu's survival of a universal deluge, the Greek myth of Deucalion, the Chinese legend of Ganyu, the Mapuche stories of Tentenvilu and Kaikaivilu, the Aboriginal Australian tales of rising waters all echo the same theme. Mainstream scholarship acknowledges these myths as cultural memories of localized floods, perhaps amplified by oral tradition over generations. It's a Black Sea deluge. Hypothesis, for instance, suggests that around 5600 BCE rising, Mediterranean waters breached the Bosporus, flooding what had been a fertile freshwater basin and creating the Black Sea as we know it, a traumatic event that might have seeded flood myths across the region. But there is another interpretation, one grounded not in mythology but in geology. At the end of the last ice age, roughly 12,000 to 8,000 years ago, global sea levels rose dramatically by some estimates. Over 120 meters as glaciers melted and poured their frozen centuries into the oceans. Coastlines that had been home to human populations for millennia were swallowed by the advancing waters. Entire landscapes vanished beneath the waves. If early civilizations had concentrated along coasts as humans naturally do, drawn to fisheries and trade routes, then the archaeological record of their existence would now lie beneath hundreds of feet of water scattered across continental shelves, buried under sediment and coral. The flood myths might not be exaggerations, but memories dim, distorted by time, but rooted in real events that destroyed real worlds. And there is evidence. Off the coast of India, sonar surveys have identified structures near Dwarka that appear to be made walls, platforms, geometric formations submerged beneath the Arabian Sea, near Yonaguni, Japan. Divers have explored a massive underwater formation with terrace levels, right angles, and carved steps. Geologists debate whether it is natural or artificial, but if the latter, it would predate known Japanese civilizations by thousands of years. In the Mediterranean, the ruins of Heracleion and Canopus, once thriving Egyptian port cities, now rest beneath the sea, though these are relatively recent, submerged by gradual subsidence rather than sudden catastrophe. Still, they remind us that the sea is a graveyard of history, and that much of the ancient world lies beyond the reach of conventional archaeology. What if the first temples, the original sacred sites that later cultures sought to emulate, were built along coastlines now drowned? What if the knowledge they contained, the cosmologies they encoded, the gods they honored, were all erased when the waters rose? The survivors fleeing inland would have carried fragment stories, techniques, half-remembered rituals and used them to rebuild in places like Egypt, Sumer, and the Indus Valley. The flood myths in this reading are not about divine punishment or moral allegory. They are trauma narrative stories of loss so profound that they were passed down through countless generations, embedded into the foundational myths of emerging civilizations. The gods did not abandon humanity. They drowned, along with the temples that housed them and the peoples who worshipped there. The flood erased the gods, but it could not erase the memory of them, nor the desperate human need to rebuild what was lost, to raise new temples, carve new stones, and hope that, in doing so, some connection to that drowned world might be preserved.
A temple is not merely a building. It is a text written in stone in shadow, to be read by those who understand its language. Sacred geometry, harmonic ratios, astronomical alignments, these are not decorative flourishes, but encoded information. A cosmology crystallized into architecture. Consider the geometry. Many ancient temples incorporate the golden ratio, approximately 1.618, into their proportions. The Parthenon's facade, the Great Pyramid's dimensions, the layout of Angkor Wat Hall reflect this ratio, which appears throughout nature in spirals, leaves, and the proportions of the human body. Was this aesthetic preference or something more? Pythagorean and later, Platonic philosophy held that certain numbers and ratios were sacred, reflecting the underlying mathematical structure of the cosmos. Music, too, was understood as mathematical harmonious intervals produced by simple ratios, 2 to 1 for an octave, 3 to 2 for a perfect fifth. If the universe itself was ordered by number, then to build a temple according to sacred ratios was to align it with cosmic law, to make it a physical manifestation of divine order. The Egyptians incorporated pi and phi into the Great Pyramid S design, whether intentionally or by following. Proportional rules that happen to encode these constants is debated, but the result is undeniable. The Mayans used base 20 mathematics and sophisticated zero-concept arithmetic to calculate astronomical cycles. The builders of Stonehenge used Pythagorean triangles, right-angled triangles with sides and whole number ratios in their layout, centuries before Pythagoras was born. These are not coincidences. They are evidence of intentionality, of knowledge systems that treated mathematics not as abstract theory, but as applied sacred science. The temples were books, and the geometry was their language. But there is more. Certain sites encode multiple layers of information. The Great Pyramid, for instance, is simultaneously a mathematical constant, encoding pi in its height to base ratio, a geographical marker. Its location approximates the center of Earth's landmass, an astronomical observatory. Its shafts align with Orion and Draco, and a geodetic survey point. Its dimensions relate to Earth's size with surprising accuracy. Whether all of this was intentional or partially coincidental remains hotly debated, but the cumulative effect is undeniable. The structure contains information far beyond its function as a tomb. Similarly, Angkor Wat encodes the Hindu cosmological units of time yugas, kalpas into the number of steps, the lengths of causeways, and the dimensions of its towers. Walking through the temple is a symbolic journey through cycles of creation and destruction spanning millions of years. Why encode knowledge in architecture? Because stone endures. Languages die, scripts become unintelligible, texts decay, oral traditions fragment, but a well-built temple can last millennia. And if you embed cosmological knowledge into its structure, into its alignments and proportions, then even if the civilization that built it collapses, even if every priest and scribe perishes, the knowledge persists. Silent, patient, waiting for someone to decode it. The temples are not merely monuments to forgotten gods. They are archives, vast, three-dimensional databases of astronomical, mathematical, and perhaps even historical information, designed by architects who understood that memory is fragile, but stone is not. They built for themselves, yes, but also for us, for whoever might come after and wonder what they knew, what they believed, and what they were trying desperately to preserve against the erosions of time and catastrophe. Walk the halls of Dendrei, the Temple of Hathor in Upper Egypt, and you will find something peculiar carved into the walls of a crypt beneath the main sanctuary. There, rendered in the flat stylized manner of Egyptian art, are images that have inspired decades of speculation. Large bulb-like objects, seated figures operating them, serpents coiled within, and what appear to be cables connecting to box-like structures. Mainstream Egyptologists identify these as symbolic representations, lotus flowers emerging from the primordial waters, the serpent as a symbol of creative energy, the whole scene a mythological metaphor for creation and rebirth. This is a reasonable interpretation, grounded in Egyptian religious iconography, but others have suggested something more literal: ancient electrical devices. The dendra bulbs, as they've been dubbed by fringe researchers, resemble in their artistic representation early Crookes tubes or arc lamps. Some have even constructed working models based on the carvings, demonstrating that such devices could theoretically function using ancient materials, though this proves only that modern people can build electrical devices, not that the Egyptians did. The mystery deepens with reports of the perpetual lamps legends from Roman and medieval sources, describing lamps found in sealed tombs that burned continuously without fuel, glowing for centuries until extinguished by the inrush of air when the tombs were opened. Pausanias, Plutarch, and other ancient historians mention such phenomena, though no physical examples survive. Could these be exaggerations? Misidentifications of naturally luminous minerals or phosphorescent organisms? Certainly. The rational explanations are plentiful. Yet the recurring motif across cultures is curious. The idea that ancient temples possessed artificial lighting, that sacred spaces were illuminated by means other than torch and oil lamp. Some stones do glow. Certain minerals exhibit luminescence when exposed to radiation or pressure. Limestone and calcite can phosphoresce faintly. In a sealed, dark chamber, such effects might seem miraculous to ancient observers. But to engineer them deliberately, to understand the principles, and apply them architecturally, would require sophisticated knowledge. And then there are the structural mysteries. Temples like the hypostyle hall at Karnak, whose interiors are so vast and dark that conventional oil lamps would produce insufficient light for the detailed carving work visible on walls and ceilings. How were these spaces illuminated during construction? Mirrors reflecting sunlight, perhaps, or systems of light wells and reflective surfaces that no longer survive. Or something else entirely, methods lost to time, leaving only the enigmatic carvings and the legends of temples that glowed with their own light. The truth, as always, is elusive, but the image persists. A darkened chamber, a device carved in stone, and the tantalizing possibility that the ancients knew how to call light from darkness in ways we have forgotten, that the temples glowed not just with divine presence, but with something more tangible, more technical, more astonishing than the texts admit. Not all temples reached toward the sky. Some delved downward into the body of the earth itself, carved from living rock, their chambers and passages descending into darkness, into silence, into mysteries that seem less concerned with astronomy and with something altogether more chthonic. Derinkuyu in Turkey is the most famous subterranean city carved into volcanic rock, descending more than 18 levels into the earth, capable of housing 20,000 people, along with livestock food stores and ventilation systems that defy simple explanation. Mainstream archaeology dates it to the Byzantine period, a refuge for early Christians fleeing persecution. But some sections appear older, the carving techniques different, the purposes obscure. The Ellora caves in India present another enigma, a series of monasteries, temples, and chapels carved from a single vertical cliff face, representing Hindu, Buddhist, and Jain traditions. The Kailasa temple, in particular, is staggering. An entire structure carved top-down from a single monolithic rock, removing an estimated 200,000 tons of stone to create a freestanding temple within a quarried amphitheater. The effort required is nearly incomprehensible, and yet the official dates place its completion in the 8th century CE, a work of centuries compressed into decades by some accounts. Why build underground? Practicality offers some answers: protection from elements, defense against invaders, thermal stability. But there is also a symbolic dimension. In many cosmologies, the underworld is the realm of transformation, death, rebirth, initiation. To descend into the earth was to journey into the womb of the world, into the domain of chthonic deities who govern fertility, death, and the mysteries of existence. Ancient initiation rites often involved descent into subterranean chambers. The Eleusinian mysteries of Greece, the Mithraic temples of Rome, the pyramid texts of Egypt all describe journeys through darkness, through trials, toward illumination or rebirth. The architecture facilitated this. Narrow passages that forced supplicants to crawl, sudden openings into vast chambers that inspired awe, acoustic effects that disoriented and overwhelmed. Some researchers propose that these were more than symbolic. They point to evidence of sensory deprivation, acoustic resonance, and even trace hallucinogens in ritual contexts, suggesting that underground temples were designed to induce altered states of consciousness, to break down ordinary perception and rebuild it according to the cosmology of the priesthood. And then there are the legends, stories preserved in oral traditions of peoples who fled into the earth during cataclysms, floods, fires, wars with gods or giants, and built cities below. The Hopi speak of the ant people who sheltered them underground during world destructions. Hindu texts mention vast subterranean realms called Patala. Tibetan Buddhism references Shambhala, sometimes described as a hidden underground kingdom preserving ancient wisdom. Are these metaphors? Probably, but metaphors are often rooted in dimly remembered realities. If a civilization faced catastrophe, climate collapse, flood, or war, and some survivors took refuge in caves or carved deeper shelters, the memory of that descent might be preserved, mythologized, and passed down as stories of gods or ancestors who dwelt beneath the earth. The forgotten gods of the inner earth are not likely to be found by drilling or spelunking. They reside in the gaps of history, in the spaces between archaeology and myth, in the silent chambers where initiates once descended to confront darkness and perhaps emerge transformed. What if the temples were never meant to be passive monuments, but active devices, instruments calibrated to harness forces we no longer recognize or understand? This is where speculation deepens, where the boundary between archaeology and imagination grows thin. Yet the question persists, whispered by fringe researchers and alternative historians. Were ancient temples designed as energy systems, aligned not just symbolically, but functionally with terrestrial and celestial forces? Consider the alignment of sacred sites along what some call ley lines, hypothetical alignments of ancient monuments, megaliths, and temples that crisscross continents. Mainstream archaeology dismisses these as statistical artifacts, patterns imposed by human pattern-seeking minds on random distributions. And perhaps that is correct. But proponents point to apparent correlations. Sites along these lines often exhibit unusual magnetic or geological properties, and many cultures independently developed concepts of earth energy. The Chinese feng shui and dragon lines, the Aboriginal Australian song lines, the Andean sex system radiating from Cusco. The Great Pyramid has been the subject of particularly elaborate speculation. Its position near the center of Earth's landmass, its mathematical encoding, its construction from limestone and granite materials with different electrical properties, and the presence of shafts that may have facilitated airflow or acoustic resonance have led some to propose it functioned as a power plant, a water pump, a healing device, or a communication beacon. These theories lack conventional archaeological support, yet they proliferate because the structure itself seems to invite them. It is simply too precise, too complex to feel adequately explained as a tomb. Similar ideas have been applied to other sites. Teotihuacan in Mexico, with its precisely gridded layout and massive pyramids aligned to celestial events, has been interpreted as a giant astronomical calculator or ritual center designed to channel cosmic energies. Stonehenge's bluestones, transported from Wales over 150 miles, are known to have acoustic properties and trace magnetic characteristics. Was their selection purely symbolic, or did the builders understand something about their material properties? Then there is the resonance phenomenon, already touched upon, but worth revisiting. If temples were designed to amplify specific frequencies, and if those frequencies affected human consciousness-altering brainwave patterns, inducing trance states, facilitating visionary experiences, then the temples were indeed machines. Not mechanical in the modern sense, but psychoacoustic instruments designed to interface with the human nervous system in precise, repeatable ways. Some researchers have proposed that ancient builders understood planetary harmonics, the idea that celestial bodies emit frequencies, that the cosmos itself hums with vibration, and that structures aligned to these frequencies could resonate sympathetically, creating spaces that tuned participants to cosmic rhythms. This edges into metaphysics, beyond empirical verification, but it reflects a worldview common to many ancient cultures. The universe as fundamentally vibrational, and temples as tuning forks linking microcosm to macrocosm. There is no proof. There cannot be, for proof requires mechanisms we can measure, technologies we can reconstruct. What remains are the temples themselves, structures that seem to encode far more knowledge than their supposed functions require, built with precision that suggests purpose beyond ornamentation, aligned in ways that speak of cosmologies both poetic and strangely practical. Were they machines? In the literal sense, almost certainly not. But in a broader sense, as technologies of consciousness, as architectural instruments designed to facilitate transformation, communion, or alignment with forces the builders considered sacred, perhaps they were. Perhaps the breath of the gods was never supernatural, but a metaphor for what happens when human awareness, architectural space, and the subtle rhythms of earth and sky converge in a single, precisely calibrated moment. The temples stand silent now, but if you truly listen, with ears attuned to more than sound, you might still hear them breathing. The ocean is the great keeper of secrets, the archive of civilizations swallowed by time and tide. For every temple that stands beneath the sun, how many more rest beneath the waves? Their stones encrusted with coral, their halls filled with fish and silence? Underwater archaeology has revealed fragments of this drowned world. Off the coast of Alexandria, divers have mapped the submerged remnants of Cleopatra's palace, streets and statuary tumbled by earthquakes and coastal subsidence. Near the Gulf of Cambay in India, sonar imaging has detected geometric formations on the seafloor structures that some argue are the ruins of a lost city predating the Indus Valley civilization, though mainstream scholars urge caution, noting that natural geological processes can produce surprisingly regular shapes. Yanaguni, the underwater formation near Japan, remains one of the most controversial. Discovered in 1987, it features terraced levels, right-angle cuts, and what appear to be carved steps and channels. Geologists are divided. Some argue it is entirely natural, a sandstone formation shaped by erosion and tectonic activity. Others point to specific features: a carved face, a rectilinear pool, tool marks that seem difficult to explain without human intervention. If artificial, it would date to a time when sea levels were much lower, placing its construction at least 10,000 years ago, making it one of the oldest structures on Earth. Dwarka, the legendary city of Krishna, described in the Mahabharata, has long been considered pure myth. Yet marine archaeologists working off the coast of Gujarat have found underwater structures, walls, platforms, and artifacts that match descriptions from ancient texts. Radiocarbon dating places some artifacts around 7,500 BCE, though the interpretation of the structures themselves remains contested. The sea is both destroyer and preserver. It erodes, yes, but it also protects, sealing sites beneath layers of sediment, shielding them from looters and weathering. In some ways, underwater ruins are better preserved than those on land, their carvings sharp, their colors sometimes intact. But they are also far harder to study, requiring specialized equipment, diving expertise, and funding that conventional archaeology often cannot provide. And so the drowned temples wait. Some have been found, most have not. The continental shelves, now hundreds of feet beneath the surface, were once coastal plains where early humans lived, built, and worshipped. When the glaciers melted and the seas rose, those landscapes vanished. The temples, if they existed, went with them. This raises a haunting possibility. What if the first temples, the original sacred sites that inspired all later traditions, are lost forever beneath the waves? What if the knowledge they contained, the cosmologies they encoded, the gods they honored, sank with them? The civilizations we know, Egypt, Sumer, the Indus, might have been not the origin points of sacred architecture, but the refugees, the survivors who carried inland whatever fragments they could salvage and rebuilt as best they could remember. The sea remembers what the land has forgotten. In its depths, beneath the dancing light and the silence, the stones endure altars to gods whose names have dissolved into salt water, temples to beliefs that drowned with the people who held them. They are still there, waiting in the darkness, their carvings softened by centuries of current, their purposes obscured but not erased. One day, perhaps, we will have the technology to map the seafloor with the precision we now apply to land. One day, perhaps, we will dive deep enough, stay long enough, to understand what the ocean has preserved. Until then, the drowned temples remain mysteries, possibilities, promises, questions carved in stone and hidden beneath the world's greatest archive. Atlantis, Mu, Lemuria. The names alone evoke wonder and fund, skepticism in equal measure mythical continents that supposedly sank beneath the waves, taking with them advanced civilizations whose knowledge seeded the cultures we recognize as history's first. Mainstream scholarship dismisses these as pseudo-archaeology, literary inventions given false credibility by generations of enthusiasts who mistake metaphor for memory. Plato's Atlantis, described in his dialogues Timaeus and Critias, is widely understood as a philosophical allegory, a cautionary tale about hubris and divine justice, not historical account. Mu and Lemuria originated in 19th century attempts to explain biological distribution patterns before plate tectonics was understood, later appropriated by occultists and alternative historians. Yet the myths persist, not because of evidence. There is none that survives rigorous scrutiny, but because they satisfy something deep in the human psyche. The sense that we have lost something, that knowledge once widespread has been forgotten, but the ancients knew more than we credit them with. The lost continent becomes a symbol of all that is irretrievable, all that time and catastrophe have erased. But strip away the pseudoscientific claims and the occult embellishments, and a curious pattern emerges. Many cultures preserve legends of a golden age, followed by cataclysm, the Greek age of Chronos, the Hindu Satya Yuga, the Chinese tale of the Yellow Emperor's paradise. These are not historical records, but they may be psychological ones, collective memories of a time before agriculture brought toil and hierarchy, before civilization created kings and slaves, before the complexities of settled life replaced the relative egalitarianism of nomadic bands. If there were temples on these mythical continents, they have left no trace we can verify. But the idea of them, temples aligned to stars that no longer rise in the same, positions temples built by peoples who understood astronomy and geometry and the movements of the earth in ways later civilizations had to rediscover. This idea has power. It shapes how we interpret the ruins that remain. Consider, if a civilization advanced enough to build sophisticated temples was indeed destroyed by rising seas or tectonic catastrophe, and if a few survivors carried fragments of their knowledge to distant shores, we would expect to see sudden, inexplicable leaps in technological and architectural sophistication among early historical cultures. And we do. The sudden appearance of monumental architecture in Egypt, the precision of astronomical knowledge in Sumer, the megalithic mastery in the Andes. All of these could be explained by gradual development, yes, but they could also be explained by inheritance, by the transmission of knowledge from an earlier unrecorded source. This is not proof of Atlantis. It is simply an observation that the pattern fits. And patterns, even when they lead nowhere concrete, tell us something about how humans construct meaning from the ruins of the past. The star temples of lost continents may never have existed, but the need to imagine them, to believe that somewhere, sometime, humanity achieved a golden age of wisdom and harmony, reveals our deepest hopes and fears. We build temples not just to honor gods, but to anchor ourselves against the flow of time, to create something that might outlast us. And we tell stories of lost temples, lost continents, lost civilizations, because we understand, perhaps better than we admit, that everything eventually is lost. Everything sinks. Everything is forgotten, except the stones. The stones remain beneath the sea or half buried in desert sands, and they whisper to us still. There is something profoundly strange about temples built at extreme altitudes, places where the air thins, where breathing becomes labor, where the boundary between earth and sky seems to dissolve. Tiahuanaco sits at 12,500 feet above sea level on the Altiplano Plateau near Lake Titicaca. At this altitude, the atmosphere is so thin that UV radiation is intense, oxygen is scarce, and the stars seem close enough to touch. Why build here? The conventional answer is that Lake Titicaca provided fish and water, and the surrounding land, though harsh, could sustain llamas and potatoes. But the monumental scale of the construction suggests motives beyond subsistence. Göbekli Tepe, though lower, sits atop a plateau with expansive views of the surrounding landscape and sky. Many megalithic sites occupy high ground, not for defense, as fortifications came later, but seemingly for visibility, for access to the heavens. The Himalayan monasteries of Tibet, perched on cliff edges and mountain peaks, are often described as sky temples, places where the physical act of reaching them becomes a spiritual discipline, where altitude itself induces altered states, where the thin air and reduced oxygen create lightheadedness that monks interpret as proximity to the divine. Some researchers have suggested that high-altitude construction was chosen specifically for its physiological effects. Hypoxia oxygen deprivation can induce euphoria, visions, and heightened sensory perception. Combined with fasting, meditation, or rhythmic chanting, the effects are amplified. Was this understood and exploited by ancient builders? Did they deliberately construct temples at altitudes where the atmosphere itself became a sacrament? And then there are the legends. The Inca spoke of their origins in the stars, of ancestors who descended from the Pleiades to teach humanity. They built Machu Picchu and other high-altitude sites not merely as cities, but as sacred landscapes, where every peak had a name, every alignment a purpose. These were places to meet the sky gods, to participate in celestial rhythms, to dwell as close to the heavens as mortal architecture could reach. From where did the gods descend? The question haunts the myths. Sumerian texts speak of the Anunnaki, who came from the heavens. Egyptian hieroglyphs depict solar barks that traverse the sky. Mesoamerican legends tell of Quetzalcoatl arriving from the east, a bearded figure who taught and then departed, promising to return. These are not historical accounts, but they are consistent. Across cultures, separated by oceans and millennia, the pattern repeats. Knowledge from the sky, teachers from above, gods who descended and then left. Were these metaphors for astronomical phenomena, comets, eclipses, meteor showers, interpreted as divine visitations? Were they mythologized memories of foreign travelers, technologically advanced seafarers whose origins were forgotten and transmuted into the supernatural? Or were they something else entirely, stories whose origins lie so deep in prehistory that their literal meaning has been lost, leaving only the narrative skeleton? The temples in the sky do not answer these questions, but they pose them with particular insistence, standing as they do at the threshold between earth and emptiness, between human habitation and the infinite. To visit them, even now, is to feel the thinness of the air, the vastness of the sky, and the strange, persistent sense that these places were built not just for worship, but for waiting for the moment when something or someone might return from above, descending once again to the high temples where earth reaches toward stars. The heavens are not static. They shift slowly but inexorably, as Earth's axis wobbles through its 26,000-year precessional cycle. Stars that once marked cardinal directions drift out of alignment. Constellations that rose on sacred dates shift forward through the calendar. The sky itself, to observers separated by millennia, becomes a different text written in rearranged stars. This creates a profound problem for cultures that embed astronomical knowledge into their sacred architecture. A temple aligned to a specific star or constellation will, over centuries, fall out of sync. The winter solstice sunrise that once illuminated a particular altar will drift, striking a wall instead, then missing the structure entirely. The carefully calibrated geometry that once mirrored the heavens becomes a monument to a sky that no longer exists. And yet, civilizations did not abandon these temples. They rebuilt them. At Karnak, evidence suggests continuous reconstruction over 2,000 years, each pharaoh adding to or modifying the existing structure. But some architectural historians have noted that certain elements' foundation, stone's subterranean chambers, the oldest sections appear misaligned with the later additions, as if they were built to mirror a celestial configuration that had already shifted by the time the Ptolemies added their finishing touches. The same pattern appears at Angkor Wat, which was modified and rebuilt over centuries. Its original Shaivite dedication later transformed into a Buddhist site. The astronomical alignments remain, but they reference different epochs, different precessional positions. The temple becomes a palimpsest layers of cosmology, written atop one another, each generation attempting to preserve and update the sacred geography of their ancestors. This is not mere renovation. It is an act of profound cultural memory, a recognition that the relationship between earth and heaven is not eternal, but dynamic, and that temples must adapt or become obsolete. But it also suggests something poignant. Each rebuilding is an admission of loss. The original alignment, the original sky, the original gods who were honored under different stars, All of these fade, replaced by new configurations, new deities, new names. The stars forgot their names, or rather, humanity forgot the names it once gave them. The Egyptians called Sirius Sopdet, the herald of the Nile's flood. But as the procession shifted, Sirius's heliacal rising no longer coincided with the inundation, and the star's mythological significance faded. New myths arose to explain new patterns. The old gods were syncretized with new ones, merged, renamed, or forgotten entirely. This cycle of celestial amnesia and reconstruction may explain why so many ancient sites show evidence of reuse, why temples are built atop older temples, why foundations often predate the structures that rest upon them. Each generation inherited ruins architecturally sound, but cosmologically obsolete, and rebuilt them according to the sky they knew, layering their own cosmology atop the remnants of the old. It is a melancholy process. Each rebuilding is both homage and erasure. The ancestors are honored by continuing their work, yet their original intent is obscured, their alignments rendered meaningless by the slow turning of the celestial sphere. The temples endure, but their purposes evolve, their meanings shift, and eventually, the connection between structure and sky becomes so attenuated that only scholars with instruments can detect what once was obvious to every priest and initiate. The stars did not forget their names. We forgot. And the temples, rebuilt and rebuilt again, bear witness to that forgetting monuments, not just to gods and kings, but to the inexorable passage of time, which changes even the heavens and leaves behind only stones that point toward stars that no longer rise where they once did. Turn inward now. Turn away from stars and stones, from alignments and acoustics, and ask a different question. What if the temples were never entirely external? What if they were mirrors, reflections of the inner architecture of human consciousness itself? This is the domain of Jungian psychology, of comparative mythology, of the mystical traditions that speak of temples within the body as sacred architecture, the mind as sanctuary, the soul as the true dwelling place of the divine. In this reading, the physical temples were maps, three-dimensional diagrams of psychological and spiritual processes designed to facilitate transformation. The Egyptian initiation rites, as far as they can be reconstructed from fragmentary texts and later accounts, involved journeys through the temple's inner chambers, a symbolic death, passage through the underworld, and rebirth into illumination. The initiate descended into darkness, confronted symbolic guardians and trials, and emerged transformed, having seen the face of the god. This was not metaphor, or rather, it was lived metaphor, enacted through ritual movement through actual space. The temple's architecture, its descending passages, its sudden expansions into vast halls, its narrow shafts that required crawling, mirrored the psychological journey of ego death and rebirth. To walk the temple was to walk the path of transformation. The same pattern appears in the mystery religions of Greece, in the Mithraic temples of Rome, in the Buddhist mandalas that serve as both maps of cosmos and guides to meditation. The external structure facilitates an internal journey. The physical temple becomes a tool for reshaping consciousness. Neuroscience offers intriguing parallels. The brain constructs spatial maps, uses architectural metaphors to organize memory. The memory palace technique, used since ancient times, leverages this by associating information with specific locations in an imagined building. What if ancient temples were designed as collective memory palaces spaces where cosmological knowledge was encoded, not just symbolically, but neurologically, imprinted through ritual repetition until the architecture of the temple became inseparable from the architecture of the initiate's mind? Some researchers have proposed that this was intentional, that temples were consciousness technologies, designed by those who understood, perhaps through empirical observation rather than theoretical neuroscience, how environment shapes perception, how repeated sensory experience creates neural pathways, how architecture can guide transformation. The temples that dream us are not passive. They are active participants in the process of becoming spaces that we make those who enter them, that inscribe there. Geometries into the minds of pilgrims and priests that survive not just as physical ruins, but as templates embedded in the collective unconscious of cultures that remember them. And perhaps this is why temples continue to fascinate, why we build them still cathedrals, mosques, meditation halls, not because we believe they literally house gods, but because we recognize, on some level deeper than reason, that certain spaces facilitate certain states of being, that architecture is not neutral, that entering a temple, even a ruined one, even one whose gods are long dead, is to participate in something that transcends time, to step into a shape that has been shaping human consciousness for millennia. The gods may have been projections, the myths may have been stories, but the experience of the temple, the sense of awe, the feeling of boundary crossing, the transformation that occurs when one moves from profane space into sacred, that is real. That is repeatable. That is the function the temples still serve, even now, even empty, even silent. They dream us still, and in dreaming them, in walking their ruins, in imagining their glories, in asking what they meant and why they were built, we participate in the dream, adding our layer to the palimpsest, continuing the dialogue between stone and psyche that has been ongoing since the first human being stood before the first sacred stone and felt, for reasons that cannot be fully articulated, that this place was different. We return now to where we began, the desert at dawn, the stones half buried in sand, the silence that speaks. The temples are empty. The rituals have ceased. The priests who once moved through these halls are dust, their chants forgotten, their knowledge fragmented into folklore and conjecture. The gods, if they ever walked here, have long since departed, or perhaps they were never here at all, except as reflections of human need, human awe, human terror before the vastness of existence. But the stones remain. Weathered, yes. Eroded by wind and time, scored by centuries of sand and rain and the slow, patient work of gravity. Yet they remain. And in their persistence, they pose a question that cannot be answered, but must be asked. What were they for? We have explored the possibilities: astronomy, acoustics, initiation, memory, geometry, divine communication. We have entertained the mainstream and the fringe, the plausible and the fantastic. And still, the question lingers, because no single answer contains the whole. The temples were probably many things at once functional and symbolic, practical and mystical, human and something more. Perhaps that ambiguity is the point. Perhaps the temples were always meant to be mysteries, structures that resist complete understanding, that invite contemplation without offering final answers. Perhaps their silence is not absence, but presence, a different kind of communication, one that speaks not to the intellect, but to something older, deeper, less easily articulated. Stand among the ruins as the sun rises. Watch the light creep across the stones, illuminating carvings that no living person can fully translate. Feel the wind that has been blowing since before your ancestors were born and will continue long after your descendants are forgotten. And ask yourself, do the stones mourn the gods, or do the gods mourn the stones? Maybe the gods were never lost. Maybe they were only forgotten, which is a different thing, not an absence, but a failure of memory, a severing of connection. The temples stand as reminders, as invitations, as unfinished conversations waiting for someone to resume them. Or maybe the gods were always a metaphor for the search itself, the human need to reach beyond the self, to touch something greater, to build something that endures. In which case the temples are not monuments to absent deities, but to that need, to the persistent, stubborn, beautiful human refusal to accept that stone and flesh are all there is. The silence after the gods is not empty. It is full of possibility, of memory, of the slow, patient breathing of the earth. The temples may be ruins, but they are not dead. They wait, as they have always waited, for someone to stand within them, and feel what those who built them felt. Awe, reverence, the sense that this place, this arrangement of stone in space, is sacred, not because gods dwell here, but because we do. Because we are the ones who build, who remember, who ask questions that have no answers and seek meaning in the mute testimony of ruins. We are the ones who walk among the stones and hear whispers. We are the gods now, or their absence, or their echo participants in a story that began before history and will continue beyond it. The temples remain, and as long as they remain, the conversation continues. Silent, patient, eternal. Perhaps that is enough.